Good night, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight on JOSA Academies / Tech Treat Academies live stream. So tonight, we want to get you prepared and ready for your CSEC exam, helping whichever way we can, for you to feel comfortable and ready for your exams. So if you're ready, just go ahead and send a thumbs up in the chat. Let me highlight the chat. Let me know that everybody is paying attention. You're ready to learn. Because tonight we're going to learn about programming. So let me just introduce myself. I'm Miss Madden. I'm an IT teacher and I have a love for IT. So let's just have fun with this lesson and learn. So make sure you have your tools and everything that you need. All right, so here we go. Does anybody know what is programming in IT? So when we talk about programming, what do you know about that? You can react in the chat, send your messages, send your replies. All right. So the first thing we're going to look at is what's an algorithm. So we're going to be looking at what to expect tonight, right? So what we'll be working on this evening, we'll be looking at what is an algorithm. So we'll be clearing up all misconceptions, helping you to understand the concept of programming better. We're going to look at how to write pseudocodes properly. We're going to be looking at if statements, for loops, while loops, and how to get familiar with exam questions to feel comfortable when you go into the exam, to not feel intimidated by how the questions are structured and what are they asking you to do. So first we must know what is an algorithm, right? So an algorithm, basically what it is, it's steps telling you how to do something, how to solve a problem. So say you want to make a sandwich, right? You must know the steps in order to carry out that task. So if you have a problem, in order to solve it, we use an algorithm by stating the steps or the instructions on how to solve that problem. So you must know the steps in which you must take in order to solve a problem. That is what an algorithm is, as simple as that, right? So if you want to make a sandwich, you must go through the steps. First, you must get your the items that you need. What products do I need to make the sandwich? You must gather your ingredients. Then you decide what is the best course of action that I can take to make my sandwich, right? How do you like your sandwich? Do you like toasted bread? Do you like regular bread? So you must know the steps in which you have to take to arrive at the best possible solution. The best possible solution would have been the best tasting sandwich. So let's continue. So the next thing we're looking at, or we're jumping into, is a pseudocode. What is a pseudocode? So basically, this is writing the steps that you wrote as an algorithm into coding language. So for instance, you wrote the steps on how to maybe add two numbers. You can say, oh, to add two numbers, you need inputs. Anybody know the IPO chart? If you know of the IPO chart, just give me a response in the chat. So the IPO chart is what we use to break down a problem into different segments or in different sections by dividing them into inputs, process, and outputs on how to solve our problem. So when we divide them up, it's easier for us to go through the motions. So based on the algorithm that you just wrote, for instance, adding two numbers, we know that to add two numbers, we must have inputs. So we're going to have two inputs, which would be the two numbers. Then we have our process, which will be basically saying adding number one and number two. So that is our process. And then we go to our output, which we want if we're adding something, that means we want the sum of two numbers. So that would be our output. So in pseudocode now, we don't transfer that into coding. Here you can see the structure of how it is written. So we always begin our pseudocode with steps. So first we must start. Remember, anybody know the characteristics of an algorithm? The reason why we begin to start, because an algorithm must have a finite number of steps. It must have a start and an ending, and it must have a terminator. So it must terminate at a point. So that is why we have to start our program and end our program. Then we put in our input. Say, for instance, we want to add and subtract our two numbers. Let's just go over to a blank screen. So here we have it, right? So we're going to write an algorithm first, and then we're going to transfer it over into a pseudocode. So the problem is we need to add two numbers. So add two numbers. So let's write the algorithm for that. So we're going to say input two numbers and then add the two numbers. You see, we're listing out our steps. What should I do now? What should I do next? Okay, so here we go. So we're adding two numbers. That's the problem. So problem, we need to add two numbers. We're going to write our algorithm, and then we're going to write it in pseudocode format. So we have input two numbers. So we must have the two numbers that we want to add together. Then we're going to add the two numbers. We're given the instructions on what steps we need to go through in order to get to our final output. And then we'll say display the results. Right? So that is our algorithm. Now, based on the structure that I just showed you for writing a pseudocode, which is we're going to start our program. So that's the first step, starting our program. The next step is we must put our inputs in. So what would be the inputs? Anyone? What would be the inputs? Just react in the chat. All right. So the first, what would be input based on the instructions given in the algorithm? We would say input number one, and then we will say input number two, because we're asking the user to input two numbers, because that's the second step that they must take, to put in the inputs, to enter the inputs. Next is the process. section. The process is going to be we're adding the two numbers. So if we're adding two numbers, we're finding the sum of two values. So we're going to say sum is equals to numbers, number underscore 1 plus number underscore 2, right? So that is our process. Next, the final thing that we had in our algorithm was to display the results. We would then say display sum, because that would be the final output after the process is completed. And we will always end our algorithm. Simple as that. That is what a pseudocode is. So above we have our algorithm and below is our pseudocode. I hope everyone is following. Let's jump back over to our PowerPoint. So today we'll be focusing on looking at different structures in coding, in pseudocode algorithm, in coding. So different structures that we use to write codes. So the first structure that we're looking at is called the selection structure. The selection structure is where we use our if statements. So the if statements is used when we have to make a decision. So there's a condition to be met, and then we give a statement that should be carried out if that condition is true or false, right? So here below, we have our structure of our if statement. So the if statement structure is we use the keyword if, condition, then the statement that has to be carried out if the condition is true, and then we end our if statement. Here, I'm going to show you a little example. Simple example. So say we want to know, so say we want to input the scores for students, right? The marks for students. And if the student's mark is greater than or equals to 50, then we'll say that they have passed. If it's not greater than or equals to 50, then we must display that they have failed. So here's our problem. So we need to write an algorithm and pseudocode so input. So this is what we're asking for. So to input a student's mark and the condition is if the student's mark is greater than or is more than 50, we're going to display that the student has passed, right? Otherwise, if that isn't true, then otherwise, we're going to display fail. So that's our problem there, that we need to create an algorithm and a pseudocode. So remember that the algorithm is step-by-step set of instructions, right? So we must write the instructions. So the first thing in the algorithm, steps that we must carry out is we must start our program. So we have to start. Next thing is, then we're going to input the marks. Next, we're going to write the statement to say if the condition is true, then this will happen. So we're going to say if mark is greater than or equals to 50, we're going to display pass. Otherwise, display fail. And then we must stop. Because remember, we must have in an algorithm, the characteristics is that it must be unambiguous, it must be finite, it must be precise, and it must terminate. All right? So these are steps that we're going to follow. So we input our marks, then we're going to write our if statement, and then we stop, right? So let's go on to, so this is our algorithm. Let's make a note. Now, based on our algorithm, we're going to write the pseudocode for this problem that we're trying to solve, right? So our pseudocode would start by having our start. So we begin it by writing start. Next, we're going to have our input. So we're going to say input the mark, right? The input mark. Next thing we're going to say is if, because that's a structure. So we must use the if mark is greater than. So using the sign, so the greater than or equals to 50, then we're going to display pass. But if this isn't true, then we're going to say else display fail, right? Is that it? Is that where we stop? Or is there, we missing something? Anybody? When we stop our program. Remember, it must have a start and an ending, a beginning and an ending. Then we're going to move on to, so that is an if statement in pseudocode, if then statement. So this is based on making a decision. So whenever we have a decision to make, we use the selection if statements, the if then and if statement. The next selection statement we're going to look at is the if else. So if else, this is where we have two statements to choose from. So we're going to say if condition, then the statement, else the statement, and then we have end if. All right. So these are our decision-making statements. So here's another problem that we have, right? So say, let's jump back over to our demonstration. So for this algorithm, we want to write an algorithm and a pseudocode hours an employee worked, right? Number of an hours an employee has worked. And if the employees, we're going to calculate overtime pay times 500 times 500. Otherwise, we're going to display no overtime. So this program wants us to calculate and display if the person has an overtime amount. So let me just quickly write the statement. What? Right? An algorithm and pseudocode to input the number of hours an employee worked, right? And we also want to say if the employee has worked more than 40 hours, we're going to calculate overtime. Okay, as so this is times the 500, right? And then otherwise, that's not true. We're going to display no overtime All right. So here's our question, right? So we have to carry this out. So we have to write an algorithm and the pseudocode to input the number of hours an employee has worked. If the employees have worked us or more than 50 hours, we're going to calculate an overtime pay for them. We're going to calculate that. It's going to be the overtime hours times $500, right? So here's how we do it. So first we have to write our algorithm. So remember, the algorithm is a step-by-step set of instructions. So let's go ahead and write our algorithm first. Can anybody tell me what I would write for my algorithm? Come on, I want to see more interaction in the chat. You can go ahead and respond in the chat. How would we start writing our algorithm? Because remember, this is worded based on how we'll explain how we go about solving this problem. We can just go ahead and respond in the chat so we can know that interacting. Remember to subscribe. So we're going to start. We must always start. As I have said before, our algorithm must have a finite number of steps. So we must have a start and an ending. We must start and it must terminate at one point. So we have to start our algorithm and then we move down to put in our inputs. Because remember the IPO chart. Remember a problem? We have two methods of solving a problem. We have divide and conquer method and we have decomposition method. Divide and conquer is where we break up the problem into subsections. We do that using the IPO method, the IPO chart. So we break it up into input, process, and outputs. So what do we need to input in order to solve this problem? What process do we need to do to solve this problem? And what output do we want? What is the end result of this? So I started the program. Based on the instructions above, it literally tells us the input. It says input the numbers of hours worked. So we're going to say input hours worked. That's our input. Next, after the input, it says the next instruction that we wrote for our algorithm is if the employee worked more than 40 hours, calculate overtime pay as our overtime hours times 500. So for this, we're going to use the if, then, else, and if statement. All right? So it's going to be if hours worked is greater than, because we said if it's more than 40. So if it's greater than 40, we're going to calculate overtime equals hours worked minus, why do you think I'm minusing hours worked? Minus 40. Why do you think I'm minusing 40? Anybody respond in the chat? All right, since as we're having no interactions. The reason that we're minusing 40, because it says greater than 40. So we must know how many hours work they've worked overtime, because 40 is the base hour. So if you work 40 hours or less, you won't get overtime pay. So we must subtract it from the total amount of hours worked. So say for instance, this person has worked 140 hours. We must minus the 40 because they won't get paid for that 40 hours because that is base hours worked, right? So we're going to say hours worked minus 40, and we're going to times it. Let me put this in a bracket so we don't get confused. So hours worked, and it said we should times the amount of overtime. So what we're doing here, where we say, oh, so we're calculating the overtime hours. So the overtime hours we're calculating in this line. So if hours worked minus 40, right? And we're going to times it by the 500, because that is what we wrote up here in our algorithm. That's the instructions that we gave, right? So that is the process statement. So we calculated the overtime hours, and then we did that by minusing the 40 hours from the total amount of hours worked, and then we multiply it by the 500. That will give us the overtime hours. Clear? Next, we're going to say display, because the next statement in our algorithm was to say display the overtime. So we're going to say display over time. That's going to tell us the overtime, right? And then we're going to say else, because if none of this is true, right? So here's how it works. So if this statement here, which is the condition, so this is classified as the condition to say if hours is greater than 40, that's a condition, right? We're going to calculate, so we're going to carry this out. This operation is going to be carried out. And then this will be outputted. But if this is false, then it will skip this section and it will jump down to say display no overtime pay, right? So that is our if then statement, else statement, and end if. So we have two statements in this selection structure. And then we're going to end it. So we have to have our end if. Yes, O'Neill, that's correct, Carrie K. All right, so we must remember to always stop or end our program because it must be finite and it must terminate. Now, since we've written our algorithm, we're then going to move on to writing our pseudocode. Who can tell me what first step they would take to write their pseudocode? You can respond in the chat with your answers. I'll pause, allow you to send your answer of your pseudocode in the chat, and then we'll go through. So I'm giving you 2 minutes. Giving you about 2-3 minutes to write your responses in the chat, and then we'll do the pseudocode. So based on the algorithm written here, I want you to write your pseudocode. So I'm going to bring it up back so you can see it. So this is our algorithm. Now, how would we write our pseudocode here? So we're starting, right? So once as we start, what's next? Any response on you? Carrie K, any response? Input hours work, correct. So after we've inputted the hours worked, what comes next? So that's our input statement. So that's step 2 being done in our algorithm. What comes after that? Remember, we're writing an if statement. All right, you need some time. We're here, we're listening. Take your time. Yeah, we have our start K. Good job. So we have our start, we have our input. Let's use our algorithm to guide us. So we input our hours worked. So in our algorithm, after we've inputted our hours worked, what comes next? Based on the algorithm that we've written. Because basically, the algorithm is the instructions that we're using to help guide us in writing our pseudocode. Right. So if hours worked is greater than 40, correct. So we start to our if statement here. So this is the process going on. Then we're going to use our then. Then what's going to happen next? Right. So if hours is greater than 40, then what are we going to do after that condition? So this is our condition with that we just wrote. So the condition is if hours worked is greater than 40, then what will happen? So if that is true, then what will go? What's going to happen? What's our next step? So use the algorithm to help you, man. The algorithm that we just wrote, use it to assist. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more lessons. Right, Kerry K? So after that, Kerry K, what comes next? So the statement, what you all just typed in the chat, if hours worked is greater than 40, then, right? So that is representing this line of instruction in our algorithm. What line comes after this one? So let's label. So let's label it. Step 1. Correct. So after if hours worked is greater than 40, then we're going to say over time. We're calculating the overtime now. So we're doing the overtime calculation. The process statement is equal. So here I'm going to use an arrow for my equal sign, because in algorithm, in pseudocode, we use or arrow. You can use the equal sign or the arrow. So equals to open bracket. So we're going to put this in bracket. Hours worked. So what they've entered here, their inputs, underscore worked minus the 40 hours, that's the general hours that you'll just get paid for without our overtime. And we're going to say asterisk from times 500. So that is calculating the overtime amount. So it's basically saying overtime is equals to hours worked minus 40 times 500. So now we've done our process statement. What comes after this? Let me take it up back to our algorithm. So take note of it. What comes after that line? Anybody has a response? So after we've calculated our overtime amount, right? What do we do next after this? So remember this line that we just did is our process. So what do we do next after calculating the overtime? All right, I'm going to help you out. Here we're going to do display. What are we going to display? Right, we're going to display the overtime that we've calculated. So that would be what will be displayed. So we'll output to say overtime is such and such amount. So display overtime we're going to show this to the user. So display, let's write a statement overtime amount or overtime pay, because that's what they want to know, is equals to overtime. Right? So this statement is being displayed because we're assuming that the condition right here that I have highlighted, hours worked greater than 40, is true. But what if that isn't true? What will happen? So what if this condition here is not true? Right, so we display the overtime. So we display the pay that they will get. Now, I'm asking if this statement, this condition rather, so the condition, right, so we're going to say else display no overtime pay, if that condition is true. So it's going to be else display no overtime pay. So they won't get any pay for overtime, right? And then after we've written our final statement, which is this, what should we do next? Almost there, almost finished. Yes, Carrie K, we have our else. Then we have our display statement to say no overtime, because if the condition isn't true, then that is what will be displayed. So if this condition is not true, hours work greater than 40 is not true, it will skip over this. So it won't try to calculate overtime any at all, and it will skip this line and just jump right here. Right, display no overtime pay. What comes after display no overtime pay? End if. Correct. So we're going to end or if statement. Terminate it. Right? So we have our end if, and after end if, what do we have? Right, Carrie K. So after we have ended the if statement, what should we do next? So we finish, we stop. Correct. So we're going to stop. So we can now terminate our program because we've completed solving the problem. So now we stop, and then if you're using a compiler or software, you would run the program to check if the results are what you want. The desired results are correct. So that's it. That is how we would calculate overtime pay for an employee. So this is our algorithm here. Here is our algorithm. When writing algorithms, you can put them in steps. So to keep track of yourself, you can put them in your steps. So you know, once as you're writing your pseudocode, you know that, oh, I'm written step 2, step 1, now I'm at this step. Then we go to step 3, and we go down to step 4, step 5, step 6, and step 7. Then we say step 8. And this is going to be step 4. Step 4. Step 4. The reason why this is step 4 is because within the information within this was already ended here. So this would only be it would be actually be step 3. So this would only be a part of this line, and this line. All right. So everyone, thank you for joining us. We will be live again next week, this time starting at 7. So if you'd like to join us again next week, you'll get access to our link and you can join. Next week we'll be going through questions and getting more in-depth in programming. This is the most tedious part of the exam. So you really need to get comfortable with it. It's worth a lot of marks. It's the third section of the paper. This is where people really fall down every year in the exams, right? So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week, Wednesday at 7 p.m. for our live stream on IT. All right. Good night, everyone. Take care.